Hello and welcome back. My name is Santiago Valencia. It's great to see you again. This is the second part in a short series where I'm showing you how to lay out a film score page so that you can then turn over to a full orchestra so they can play that music for that blockbuster movie that you've been hired to write for. In our last video, we talked about the sections of instruments and where they go exactly on the page. If you haven't seen that video, the link's right below. Check it out and then come right back. In this video, we're going to dive a little deeper into each one of those sections, and I'm going to try to give you a full list of all the instruments you would find in that section so you have a better working knowledge on what you can choose to write for. Those sections basically are the woodwinds, brass, strings, and other sections like harp and keyboards and even synthesizers. And something I call an additional section that you'll find some unconventional instruments for the modern orchestra, but that you can still actually find in a modern film score today. Now today's video might be just a wee bit longer than normal because I'm really going to try to give you a full and robust list of all the instruments that you would find in today's modern orchestra. Now, if you'd like to fast forward to a particular section, I'll have the timestamps below in the description for you. Okay, here we go. First up is the woodwind section. Here is the following list of all the main instruments that you would find within the woodwind section. Okay, so here we are, our first section going into the instruments specifically. Our first section are woodwinds. Now, typically at the very top of the score, and this could vary, but I'm going to try to give you these instruments in the order you would typically find them on the page. Again, it's not always so, but we're going to try to make it as real world as we possibly can. Okay, so the first instrument, we're going to have a piccolo flute. Now, this piccolo flute is a little bit smaller than the regular flute, therefore it produces a higher pitch. Next up, we would have our regular flute. And then we would have a couple of other flutes. In this next case, we would have an alto flute in G. Then the opposite of the piccolo flute, we would have another flute that's a little bit bigger and would produce a lower tone than your regular flute, and we're talking about the bass flute. Next up, going to another instrument, we have the oboe. And after that, we have the oboe d'amore and A in the key of A. And then we have the bass oboe after that. Sometimes it's called the heckelphone, so I put that in parentheses, but again, they're interchangeable. Bass oboe or heckelphone. Heckelphone is typically the older name for it. Okay, moving on. Now we've got the English horn, and sometimes you're going to see it on older scores and even some more current scores named cor anglais, which I believe is French, the French name for the English horn. And let's move on to some clarinets. Here's our most common one, the clarinet in B flat, then the clarinet in A, the clarinet in E flat, which is typically the piccolo clarinet, so that's going to produce a higher pitch tone, typically like an octave higher. And then we're going to have the clarinet in D. Next up, the alto clarinet in E flat, the basset horn in F, the bass clarinet in B flat. And then, of course, the last one, the major last one, is the contrabass clarinet. Now, and this could be in either B flat or E flat. And the contrabass is typically going to produce a tone lower. And typically when you have contra anything, contrabass, you're typically going to find that the written pitch on the paper might be, let's say, C, below middle C on the keyboard, but it's going to actually sound an octave lower than that, than what's written on the actual page. And we'll get to that a little bit more when we get onto our next episode, seeing everything on the page. And move into some saxophones. Next is the soprano sax in E flat, the soprano sax in B flat, the alto sax in E flat, the tenor sax in B flat, the baritone sax in E flat, the bass sax in B flat, and those are your saxes. Now, one quick word on the saxophones. Typically, you really don't find a lot of saxophones in the modern orchestra nowadays. But every once in a while you will, but typically you won't, but they're here as an option to write for nevertheless. Okay, moving on to the bassoons. And then lastly, we have the contrabassoon, sometimes called the saxophone, if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm probably hacking that completely wrong. Okay, so these are basically the woodwinds that you're going to typically find in the modern orchestra. This is a good list for you to choose from, so you know what you're able to write for when it comes to the woodwinds. Now, the keys that I've given you here, is it every single key for that particular instrument? No, there are some others, but realistically, this list here is showing the most common keys that you're going to find for those particular instruments. Okay, so that takes care of the woodwinds. Let's move on to the next section. Next up, the brass section. The following is a list of the main instruments that you will find in the brass section. All right, here we go. A few less instruments in this, but still very, very important and powerful instruments in this list. First up is the French horn in F. Now, sometimes on the paper, you're going to see this as horn in F or F horn, okay? And sometimes I got a little confused because, well, was the F horn the French horn or was the F horn a horn in F? Well, actually, in this case, it's both. So when you look at F horn or horn in F or FR horn, sometimes you'll see it abbreviated. Either way, it's the same thing. French horn, which is also in the key of F. Okay, moving on to our trumpet in C. And then we have another common one, which is a trumpet in B flat. I believe the trumpet in B flat is a little bit more common than C, but you can still see a C every once in a while. Okay, now we have the higher pitched trumpet, which is, of course, the piccolo trumpet. Then we have a cornet in B flat. And the lower tone trumpet, which is the bass trumpet. We also then next have a flugelhorn, which has a great unique tone to it. I love the flugelhorn. And moving on to our trombones. Here we are. We have an alto trombone. Then the more common one, which is the trombone tenor or tenor trombone. And then the lower cousin, our bass trombone. And then even lower below that, we have a contrabass trombone, which sounds an octave lower than the bass trombone. Pretty powerful stuff. Speaking of powerful, here we are with the big old tuba. And then another cousin to the tuba, which is the tenor tuba, sometimes pronounced the euphonium, if I'm pronouncing that right. Okay, great. So those are the basic instruments that you're typically going to find in your brass section. All right, moving on. Right below the brass section, you'll find the percussion section. Now, this is the biggest section when it comes to variety and amount of instruments that you'll find within the section. Here we go with the list of the percussion. Starting off with the timpani, sometimes called the kettle drums. Next up, we'll have tom-toms. And then we'll have two types of drums. First off is the snare drum, followed up by the bass drum. And let's add one more drum there, and we're going to go ahead with the steel drums, sometimes called the steel pan or steel pan drums. Next, marimba. After that, we'll have a xylophone, a vibraphone, And this is next up is a glockenspiel. And how about some bells? Let's get some orchestra and sleigh bells, sometimes called orchestra bells, sometimes called sleigh bells. Next up we have some chimes, or sometimes called the tubular bells. Then next up we have some wood and temple blocks. Next, cymbals. And the piatti cymbals. These come with a nice big loud crash that you'll hear in a lot of film scores. Next up are the gongs. Then the triangle. Then for a lot of effect when it comes to thunder, of course, the thunder sheet. We can also have some congas and bongos. And very similar to the wood and temple blocks, we'll have some claves. These can be a little bit higher pitched. Then, of course, the cowbells. And crystal glasses. Of course, no orchestra would be complete without a tambourine. So this next one, when I discovered, I thought it was actually someone joking with me, but it really is not a joke. It's a very specialized instrument. It looks just like Thor's hammer, except in this case we call it Mahler's hammer. Why Mahler's hammer? Because it is named after the composer Gustav Mahler, who's from Austria, lived at the end of the 1800s into the 1900s. And if you haven't heard of Gustav Mahler, he's definitely a person you want to listen to the music, because a lot of our film score composers would credit him as being one of their very first composers that started giving us our film scoring sound, if you will. So check him out, Gustav Mahler. Okay, so now our last instrument on this list is another pretty trippy instrument, okay? It is called the anvil. And the anvil is basically this big piece block of metal that you go ahead and hit and produces a really interesting and distinctive sound. It's pretty powerful as well. This instrument, if I'm not mistaken, has actually been used in the soundtrack for Aliens, 1986, James Cameron. I believe James Horner used it. But Howard Shore has used this instrument, so has John Williams. And another interesting tidbit, the Beatles actually used this in Maxwell Silver Hammer song. Ringo Starr actually used the anvil and played the anvil on that song as well. So pretty interesting. Okay, so there we go. There is our percussion section. Pretty big list. A lot for you to choose from and mix and the whole thing. Of course, this isn't 100% of what anyone could put in the percussion section for their own purposes, but basically in your modern film score orchestra, this is about 98% of what you're really going to find in the real world. Okay, so moving on to our next section. Next up, the smallest section on the page, if you can even call it a section, because we're talking about the harp, which you'll typically find between the percussion and the keyboard section. Here we go on to our next section, which I'm calling the keyboard section. Not only are you going to find piano, but you're going to find a few others that go within this area of the page. Here's a list of keyboards for you. One of my favorite sections, not a big section, but I think a pretty important section, and that is the keyboard section. Okay, starting off with one of my very favorite instruments in the world. This is such a versatile instrument, from classical to blues to jazz. And of course, we're talking about the piano. Now, the piano that's typically used in modern day orchestras are big concert grands that have the full 88 keys to them. Interestingly enough, there are actually pianos in the world that are much larger than 88 keys. Some people think that the biggest is about a 97 key piano. But the reality is that I believe Stewart and Sons manufactured a piano with 102 keys, if you can believe that. But typically we have our 88 key piano concert grand in the orchestra. Next up is the celesta, or sometimes people will call it the celeste. Now this was a very famous instrument, and I'm sure if you've heard the Harry Potter theme written by John Williams, which I believe is Hedwig's theme, if I'm pronouncing that right, you'll hear celesta throughout that whole entire thing. Very, very famous piece for the celesta. Next up is the harpsichord. After that, we will have the organ. Gonna have our nice little scary organ in there sometimes. Then the harmonium. And finally, one that people don't really think about as a keyboard instrument, but when you really think about it, it is, and that is the accordion. Okay, so there we have it. The keyboard section as you would find in a modern day orchestra. Moving on, our next section, which I'm calling the synthesizer section. Now, there's so many synthesizers to choose from a physical synthesizer to a virtual one. There's so many, but this section is dedicated to that, and typically it's found right below the piano section. Here's some ideas for synthesizers. Just to name a few of the more important ones in the world, like the Moog Mini Moog, okay, that's a really famous one. The Prophet 5, going back to the 80s with all those hit songs in the 80s if you're into that, and that was the Yamaha DX7 that was, that's credited for a lot of great sounds in the 80s. And of course, probably my very favorite synthesizer of all time, and I'm sure you'd recognize it if you've seen this very famous movie. Of course, I'm talking about Harrison Ford's Blade Runner 1982. That famous sound from the theme of Blade Runner came from a Yamaha CS80. Okay, so of course there are countless and countless more to count, but this is the section that you would basically go ahead and put in your synthesizers. Sometimes we'll call them pre-records because they've been recorded previously, and the orchestra will play along to those pre-records of synthesizers. Now, pre-records aren't always synthesizers. They can be other things too, but that's sometimes what they call them as well. Okay, cool. So there's that section on synthesizers. Moving on. Okay, next up. Here's an easy one. Let's call this either the choir or the chorus section. You can use either name. It's easy because we're talking about voices. So you're either going to find men's choir, women's choir, children's choir, or a mix thereof. You're going to have your bass, your baritone, tenor, alto, and soprano voices all within this section here. All right, in our last episode, we talked about a section that I named the additional section. This is a section of instruments that aren't exactly commonplace in the modern orchestra, but can have a place depending on the film, whether it's a time period piece or maybe kind of ethnic period piece that will have specialized instruments in it. So here's a quick list of some ideas for instruments that you might find in this additional section. Okay, here we go on to our next section. Now this is a little bit of a mix of sections and specific instruments, so we're just going to call it other sections and instruments. Hey, that's original. Okay, so this next instrument, very common in the orchestra, and it really kind of sits alone in its own section, and I'm talking about the harp. Typically the harp could be found on the page just above the piano, typically, but not always. But this one kind of is such a big chunk, well, not really a big chunk, but a generous chunk of the page that it kind of, in my opinion, is its own section. Okay, other instruments that can be found are the guitar, the electric guitar, even the electric bass. And here's a fun instrument called the theremin. Now, theremin was very famous in the 60s for being in some of the Beach Boy hits that were in the 1960s, and it can still be played in the orchestra. It's almost like a little bit of a synthesizer in a small way, but it can create some pretty interesting and sometimes eerie sounds. So here's another section we've already talked about, and that is the pre-records. As mentioned already, usually it's synthesizers, but it could be other instruments as well, like maybe a classical or flamenco guitar that the orchestra goes ahead and plays to during the recording session. So that's the pre-records. Now we're on our last, and in my opinion, the most important section of the whole entire page. That is, of course, the string section. The string section is basically found at the very bottom of the entire score, typically speaking. On here, you're going to find the main 5 instruments of the string section. So let's go ahead a little bit more in depth, and let me show you a few of those instruments in the string section. Now, typically there are really only 5 instruments that you're going to find in the string section. Really kind of like 4, but we split up that one instrument in 2 sections. So let me show you what I'm talking about. The violins. We will typically have a violin section 1. These are the first violins. Right below that, you're going to find the second violins. Second section of violins right below that. And below that, you're going to find an instrument that looks just like a violin, just a little bit bigger. They all kind of look like a violin, just a little bit bigger actually. And that is the viola. All right, next is the cello or the celli or the violoncello. You have a few names for it depending on who you ask. And the last one at the very bottom you're going to find is the big sucker, which is the bass or the contrabass or the double bass. This goes by 3 different names and sometimes has 3 different abbreviations on the actual page. And we'll go into all the abbreviations later on, but we're basically talking about the exact same bass. Now, if you're a jazz enthusiast and you have the upright bass kind of going on, right? This is that same instrument, just used in a different fashion. Now, there is one more line, like I mentioned earlier, that sometimes it will pop up, and that is the violin solo section, which you'll find at the very top, separated from violin section 1. And that's just for clarity, I think it's easier to read if there's a violin solo that's really specific and important to the piece. I think it's probably a good idea to have that violin solo at the very top on its own, just for clarification and, makes your piece look a little bit more organized. So there we go. There is the string section. All right, we finally made it through. Is your brain still intact? Because I know I sent a lot of information your way. But again, I was trying to attempt to give you a full list of what instruments you would find in today's modern orchestra and then some, so you're not caught off guard when you're writing your next masterpiece. Now, did I miss any instruments? Because if I did, I would love for you to go ahead and put that in the comments below so that we can all learn from the information. Now, was this list of use to you? Because if it was, I might suggest you go ahead and save it in one of your playlists in your YouTube account. That way, you can refer to it at any old time. And if for some reason you hit the like button on the way, that would be cool too. So where's the score page, Santiago? That's what we'll finally be getting to in the next video in this series, the score page in depth. We've gone over the sections, we've gone over the instruments. Now it's time to finally take what we've learned and put it on the actual page. If you like what you see so far, consider subscribing. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so it'll let you know when I come out with new videos on film scoring, songwriting, movies, and much, much more. Again, my name is Santiago Valencia. Thank you so much for stopping by, and until next time, it's been a real slice. Take care.